What does boxing, tax evasion, murder, and the mob all have in common? I'll give you a clue somewhere over here. Today we are talking about the dark side of Don King. Hello, my name is Tasha and this is my series White Rabbit, where we dive into anything spooky, odd, or just interesting while I apply some special effects makeup. I am so excited about today's video because this one just called to me. I was pretty set on covering mob ties to boxing originally. And so I was researching, and in my suggested videos on YouTube, I saw this random documentary from maybe like the 90s. I think it was a Timeline documentary. This documentary was like gripping, so good, and it was like at that moment, it has to be Don King. Like, I have to talk about this. In honor of this week's subject, I will be applying some boxing injury makeup, and I'm so excited, so let's just get started. Let's give some history. Don King was born in 1931 in Cleveland, Ohio. He was one of 6 children. He was raised by his mother after his father died in a plant explosion when he was just 10 years old. After finishing high school, he did attempt college, but after just a year, he quit and he started running a numbers racket in Cleveland. A numbers racket is an illegal gambling operation that involves betting on the outcome of random numbers. It typically involves a central figure known as the banker, who accepts these bets from participants on various combinations of numbers. The winning numbers are often determined by the outcome of legitimate events such as horse races or the stock market. The participants would place bets and hope that their chosen numbers match the numbers selected by the banker. I don't know what type of numbers he ran, but he did have multiple gambling houses in Cleveland. One day, someone decided to rob one of these gambling houses, and Don was having none of that. He actually killed the man, but it was deemed a justifiable homicide. 13 years later, Don would take his second life. He was actually caught in the act murdering someone by a police officer. This officer was just driving along and he sees Don King stomping a man on the ground. So he pulls up, he drew his weapon, he told him to put the gun away. And before he put the gun away, he actually gave, as the officer described, one last swift kick to the head. Some people rushed to provide aid, but he did not survive. His last words were, "Donald, I'll pay you." Apparently, he owed Don $600, which is like over $5,000 today. Between 1951 and 1966, he was arrested like 32 times, all different types of charges. A lot of them were gambling. He was like the guy in Cleveland at the time. He was making $15,000 a day, which in today's money is like $150,000 a day, a portion of which was being paid for protection of his business to the local mob. He also took $30,000 of that hard-earned money, and he used that to pay off witnesses to the murder, and it worked because they did not show up to court. But there was only one witness that they needed, and that was the officer that caught him in the act committing the murder, who he also attempted unsuccessfully to bribe. In the end, he was found guilty of second-degree murder. That wasn't really the end, because after the trial, the judge actually met with Don King and his lawyer, and magically, his charges were all of a sudden dropped to manslaughter. And just a tidbit, the governor would later end up giving him a full pardon, even though someone witnessed you, a police officer, but he was pardoned. After this debacle, one of Don King's friends really wanted to get him out of that life. His name was Lloyd Price, and Lloyd was a friend of Muhammad Ali. With the help of Mr. Price, Mr. King convinced Mr. Ali to do a charity event that he was promoting for a children's hospital. So this was in 1962. The hospital got $20,000 and Don King was officially in the boxing business. Now, I read that the event grossed over $80,000, but I also read that the hospital only got $20,000. So this is also around the time where Mr. Don King adopted the trademark hair. 2 years later, Don King solidified his place in the boxing world when he arranged a heavyweight fight between then champion George Foreman and Muhammad Ali. In repayment to his friend Mr. Price for introducing him to Muhammad Ali, Don King cheated him out of his share of the profits. He was supposed to get 50% and he got nothing. That really didn't matter because Muhammad Ali eventually cut ties with Don King after he cheated him out of over $1 million from a different fight that he lost. He had to sue, and even then Don King convinced one of Muhammad Ali's friends to convince him to drop the lawsuit and to take $500,000 and to sign a release form. At the time, Muhammad Ali was really ill and he did not want to spend years going back and forth to court over money, so he accepted the money and he signed the release. For 17 years, Don King controlled the world of boxing. He controlled all of the major contenders. He even controlled the TV rights. He exploited the vulnerabilities of so many boxers. He just had a way of manipulating people for his personal gain, and he was very charismatic and it worked. I want to give you an example of this type of manipulation that I'm talking about. In the 1980s, a man by the name of Tim Witherspoon was like a new hot boxer that was out, and Don King had his eyes on him. So after about 12 or 13 fights, Don King approached him about doing a fight that he would promote. Tim agrees to this, but he later got an ear infection and his doctor really advised that he shouldn't fight, that he needed to pull out of this fight. Don was pissed, so he calls up the Cleveland Boxing Commission and he had them suspend him so he couldn't fight. Don King told him that the only way that he would lift the suspension is if he agreed to sign a long-term contract. Originally, Tim was like, hell no. But after some time and realizing that he didn't have a lot of options, so he set up a meeting with Don King and he went to meet him. Now, not only was this man not allowed to have a lawyer, he had to sign not one, but 4 different contracts. There was a blank one. There was one with a 33% manager fee, which was the one that they would send to the commission. There was one with a 50% manager fee, which is what he would actually take. And then he also had to agree for Don King's stepson to be his new manager. So now Tim has Don King for a promoter, his stepson for a manager. He's 4 contracts in of some legal bull. He doesn't even have a lawyer present with him. I just highly doubt that he understood the gravity of what he was signing in this paperwork. I cannot believe he signed a blank contract. Never, ever, ever, ever. But you know, this was just a poor kid and he wanted to make some money and he wanted to fight. He agreed and he did everything that Don King asked. That relationship changed when Tim filed a lawsuit against Don. Don King then retaliated by blacklisting him against fighting any of Don King's fighters, which all of the top 10 fighters were his fighters, and if you couldn't fight any of the top 10, you would never have the chance at a championship. So Tim's new manager stated that he had been threatened to drop the lawsuit or that he wouldn't have to worry about the lawsuit because he wouldn't be breathing long enough to make it to court. Don King's mob ties were an open secret in the boxing world. Like, nobody really talked about it, but everybody knew. And it was not uncommon for Don King to send some of these mobsters to do some muscle work for him. He liked to intimidate fighters. He liked to intimidate witnesses because Don King was sued so many times. At one point, he was like a record holder for having more lawsuits than anyone else in boxing history. He was even investigated by the FBI at one point for his mob ties. He was even caught on tape admitting that he had met with a local known mobster about a problem that he was having with a rival promoter. Now, the reason Don King would send his mobsters to intimidate the fighters is because he would want certain fighters to throw certain fights. He just could not get out of gambling. He loved it so much. It's all he knew. He would have these fighters throw fights and then he would make money, the mobsters would make money, everybody would be happy except the fighter. Don King was never prosecuted for this. He did end up being indicted for tax evasion, but he was acquitted of all charges. After he was acquitted of these charges, he flew every single one of the jurors to London for a boxing match as a thank you. Don King's manipulation of these fighters continued with Mike Tyson. He entered Tyson's life at a really vulnerable point. He had just lost two of his mentors back to back that were like father figures to him, and he was going through a divorce. His wife, Robin Gibbons, had just left him. He was just emotionally in shambles at that time. That unfortunately made it really easy for Don King to just wiggle his way right on in there, and soon he was acting as his promoter and his advisor. He eventually gained total control over Mike Tyson and all of his affairs. He even pulled him away from people that were really close to him. However, his control over Mike Tyson's career led to legal battles and claims of financial exploitation. Lawsuits were filed by boxers, managers, promoters. They were all making similar claims. He manipulated contracts. He coerced, that's such a weird word for me to say, coerced. He coerced fighters and he withheld earnings. King's legacy is one of controversy. It's one of manipulation. I mean, it's undeniable that he played a major role in shaping the sport and shaping the way the sport was viewed, getting recognition. A lot of his actions just kind of shadow that. I hope you found all of that super interesting. I know I did, and I hope you found my boxer injury beat down makeup interesting as well. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and share if you liked the video. Thank you. Bye.